Welcome to LDEI Live Online. I'm your host, Sheila Cry. These monthly or bi-monthly online events are a valued benefit of membership in Les Dames d'Escoffier International. Our goal is to present a wide range of topics that support your professional growth and culinary passions, whether you're building your business, exploring culinary traditions, or navigating your culinary life. If you have suggestions for future topics or speakers, I encourage you to reach out. You'll find my contact information in the membership directory, and the live online committee would be delighted to hear from you. Today's presentation explores the diverse cultural influences that have shaped Southern cuisine in the United States. We begin with Liz Williams, founder of the Southern Food and Beverage Museum and the SOFAB Research Center in New Orleans. She'll highlight European cultural and culinary influences that have left a lasting mark on the South. And if you're ever in New Orleans, don't miss a visit to the museum. It's a fascinating and flavorful journey through the region's culinary heritage. Following Liz, Dame and Professor Psyche Williams-Forson, who teaches American Studies through the Anthropology Department at the University of Maryland, will speak, and her research centers on African American history and culinary traditions. She'll offer insight into how experiences and contributions of involuntary African migrants continue to shape American society and cuisine. And now, without further ado, let's welcome Liz Williams.
Thank you, Sheila. It is really exciting to be here, and thanks to all of you for participating. It's nice to see all of your faces. I am excited to be able to talk about one of my absolute favorite topics, and that is the merger of so many influences that have created the food of the South. One of the things that I really want to say about it before we actually begin about specifics is to talk about the fact that cuisine is a social invention. And what that means is that everyone who either eats or gathers or grows or hunts and who cooks have participated in making the cuisine. So some people have had a heavier hand in the participation, but everyone is doing this. And we know this when we eat together. If I go to your house, and of course, I'm going to talk about gumbo because I'm from New Orleans, but if I go to your house and you serve gumbo, I recognize that that's gumbo, even though it is different from the gumbo that I serve. And when you come to my house, you also recognize that what I'm serving you is gumbo, even though it's different from yours. And in fact, when I'm eating yours, I might find that you do something that I really like. And I steal that little idea and I start incorporating it in my gumbo. And that is how the social invention works. So, unlike when a chef invents something, for example, still speaking of New Orleans, um, the, the food that we call bananas Foster was actually invented, not that it didn't have influences, but was invented at Brennan's restaurant. It has now become part of the canon of the food of New Orleans, and you can get it at many restaurants, and people make it at home. Um, but we can identify when it started. But for most cuisine, that is impossible. It changes slowly, and we adapt and adopt what the influences around us are. So I just want to start with that because I think that too often we forget that it's not just about this was brought here from that country and this was brought from that country. And we just talk about the foodstuffs and we don't talk about the other aspects of it, taste and attitude. And the other aspect besides the actual foodstuffs would be techniques that come from other places. So just keep in your mind that all of those things come together when we're talking about the development of a cuisine. So let's talk about what was here because we all know something about American history, and I'm supposed to be talking about the Europeans who came. So I guess what I need to do is share my screen and get started with this. Why is this not working? There we go. Um, so we're going to talk about the Europeans and their influence on the food of the South. So they found lots of things when they got here, the Europeans who came. So we have people coming at different latitudes. You know, if we start with Columbus, we're talking about the being influences that happen in the Caribbean, but we have the English and the Dutch. There's some Germans, there's Spanish, there are people coming to the Americas. And what they found was lots of things that were unfamiliar to them. They found corn and peppers, they found pecans and different kinds of beans. You know that except for the fava bean, in Europe and in Africa, there were only peas. And I think that that's a kind of an interesting concept. Potatoes, tomatoes, sweet potatoes, cacao, squash, turkey, avocado, vanilla, just to begin to talk about what was already here. There were also things that were familiar. There were deer and duck and other kinds of birds that were eaten. And of course, if we think about the three major continental shifts that we had before people were we landed in what we have today, then we know that some of these animals and some plants were similar, and they broke off as the shifting of the continents happened. So let's talk about our influences and all the things that have happened. So we've got the indigenous foods, and I want to talk a little bit about, and for some reason it won't go to the next slide. I don't do this enough to know, I don't know why, but now it works. Okay, so I won't talk about it. So this is about the Columbian Exchange. Columbian Exchange also includes Africa, but I am talking about what the Europeans brought, so I didn't want to step on Psyche's toes. But you can see that the Europeans brought with them sugar, coffee, tea, wheat, rice, soybeans, oranges, pigs, and cows. These things changed the landscape, and they changed the food of the Americas. The native people, the indigenous people, were pretty quick, for example, to adopt using pigs and cooking with pigs. Um, and they weren't in any way stopped by the fact that they weren't there before. Today, a lot of the South continues to fight with the fact that wild pigs are a threat to agriculture in the South. And these were the pigs that were brought by the Spanish when they came to uh, circumnavigate the globe. They actually brought pigs all over the globe. And those pigs were allowed to go wild because they brought them on their ships just to have something else to eat besides fish or dried meat. And those, they were too many often, or they would reproduce during a journey, and they were allowed to go wild. And so they did go wild, and they really have continued to cause havoc today. Um, so we have that to consider. All right. So the English. So the English are really an interesting group to talk about. They defined the idea of colony. In England, this was a land grab which spread to some of the other parts of Europe. Um, the idea of coming to another place, grabbing land so that you could grow food that could go back to the European country, as well as other resources. It was a way to identify power because you had a, um, a, a bulkhead, so to speak, in another continent. But they also brought some other things with them. They brought the concept of making pies and baking. They brought the idea of a full breakfast. And some people have also argued that they brought the idea of sweet tea because they added sugar to their hot tea, which then, once there was ice available, was transferred to sweet tea. It is true that if you look at all of the places where sweet tea is eaten in the South or drunk in the South, it is places where the English had a large presence. Places like Louisiana, where sweet tea is not the prevalent tea when you say iced tea, they were not here, and I think that's an interesting thought. I also want to say something about the English before I go into the Spanish, and that was that the English really believed that there was England and there were the colonies. If you went to the colony, part of what you were doing was establishing English ideas in the colony. So that meant that you had to remain English. That meant you had to continue to dress like an English person, eat like an English person. And so they were preferring the foods from England. And in the early days, as this happened in Virginia, there were settlements where people wrote in their diaries that they were starving to death because none of their crops were successful because the latitude was wrong. Now, they didn't necessarily know that, but they did know that their crops were not successful. Now, there was food everywhere. We all know that the native people lived for thousands of years in the Americas and they were eating. We can be assured that they were eating. So there was food, but in the journals of the people who had died and were found, the journals found by follow-up settlers to those settlements, they read those journals and saw that because it would have meant to eat the indigenous food and the food given to them and offered to them by the native people, which they refused, that they would become un-English. And so it's one of those things that is an appalling idea, but they actually would rather die than not be English. I think that's amazing. Okay, so here we have the Spanish, and we've already talked about them bringing pigs, beef, chickens. They brought olive oil, wine, peaches, figs, watermelon, and spices. And most of the wine that is made in the South with the not perfect wine grapes, like muscadine, that is all very Southern, but it was brought to us by the Spanish. One of the things I think is really important to know about is the spices. Now, they brought spices because the Spanish had a long history of being ruled by the Moors. And so you had this um, spice trail from the Arab traders, and it went all the way to Spain, through Africa to Spain. And in some places, it went to Venice and overland to Spain. And so that taste for different kinds of spices, cinnamon and all of the sweet spices for the baking that was brought to us by the English, all of that came from the Spanish. Um, and also they brought foods, the Spanish, that they had found in from other places. And that's also very important because it was the Spanish who brought up from South America into North America things like potatoes. That was not something that you would have found in the northern part of the Americas, but the Spanish who went all over North and South America found potatoes and brought them and reestablished them also and introduced them into North America. They also brought things like peaches, which were from Asia, watermelon, very popular. In Africa, the Spanish brought those over with them. The French. Now, the Spanish, going back to the Spanish, um, we know of them in Mexico and Texas when it was part of Mexico and the southwestern part of the United States. But let's not forget Florida. And they established St. Augustine, the earliest colony, and that or the earliest settlement. And that is a place where we see a lot of Spanish influence. The Spanish also were in Louisiana as a way to buffer themselves from the English colonies, which were to the east of Louisiana. So the Spanish were there, their influence was the greatest in the Southwest. Okay, let's talk about the French. So the Louisiana was claimed by France in the late 17th century, and by the early 18th century, New Orleans had been founded, and colonies and little towns. You'll see all those French names as you go up the Mississippi River. Those are towns that were established by the French going all the way to Detroit. And those were very different from the English colonies in a number of ways. One of the ways which I think is very significant is that the English, as I said, wanted to remain English, and they felt that they were in a strange land, whereas the French considered that everywhere they went became France. And so the Louisiana, the whole of Louisiana and other places in the Caribbean were French. And that meant that if you ate an alligator in Louisiana, you were not eating strange food. It was French. It was a French alligator. And so it made it possible for you to be willing to eat the indigenous food. It's also true that the French brought with them their attitude from the Enlightenment, and that attitude said that they would apply reason to the arts. Now, there were the arts that the Age of Enlightenment also affected England, but in England it was something applied to government, and it was something that was applied to literature and philosophy. But in France, it was also applied to the arts like music, and as well as literature and the visual arts, and they considered cooking and preparing cuisine to be an art. So that idea was also brought with the people who settled in all of the French regions. So what we've got is a crazy sort of network here. And I've only talked about the main groups that have come. I didn't talk in all the detail about every single European influence that there is. I tried to kind of simplify this as best I can. So anyway, in the 13 colonies, the ones from the South are Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And those are the places where we see the greatest English influence because those were the 13 colonies that were ultimately owned by England. Even though they didn't all start out as English colonies, they wound up being English colonies. So you see a different kind of influence there. And then I have a list here of the southern states, and I'm calling these things the South, even though some of them are not related to the Mason-Dixon line, because, for example, Texas, if you wanted to talk about Southern influence, you would be talking about East Texas, but I didn't want to cut Texas in half. So you see that there's no, there's no hard line. There's not a wall somewhere that says, okay, this is where the food stops. And so you see lots and lots of fluidity among all of these places. So anyway, I realize that I haven't gone through and made a list of these foods are influenced by this place and that place. I did talk about biscuits and cake and pies, but basically, what I want to say is that the Europeans brought foodstuffs, they brought attitudes, they brought ways of thinking about food to the South. So much of what is eaten in the South is because it grows there. And I know that Psyche is going to talk about the enslaved Africans and their enormous influence and African American influence on the food. And we only have 20 minutes, so that's the best I can do. But I hope that you have some questions, and I want to just turn it over to Psyche.
Okay, thank you, Liz. I'm going to hold on a minute. I'm not going to share just yet. Let me close some screens and get ready here. Okay. I think that this will do it. All right, great. So I'm going to share my screen. There we go. All right, can everyone see that okay?
Yes, you can see
Okay,
it.
perfect, perfect. Okay. So thank you all for coming out today to hear our conversation. Um, so I'm gonna pick up and overlap a little bit with what Liz has said, beginning with Columbus and mentioning that as early as 1492, when Columbus came to this country or discovered what was considered the New World, there were enslaved Indians prior to there being enslaved Africans. And yes, what Liz said about the English did not know how to survive, and they didn't want to be un-English. They also did not want to eat foods of the natives because they felt that native people were dirty, etc. And we know that a lot of these um, thoughts pervade even today. So I'm going to start with the notion that meals tell stories, right? So if meals tell stories, then what do we learn about African American culture, lives, and histories when we study food? What do we learn about European and Native American lives as well. So several years ago, I came upon, because I am a professor in American studies, I'm actually an affiliate of anthropology, meaning my work overlaps with anthropology, but I'm in the American Studies department. And so as when I was teaching many, many years ago, I came across this qu- TED talk by Nigerian author Chimamanda Adichie, right? And I would encourage any of you to look at it. She delivers it very well, in a way that is very conversational. And she talks about the danger of the single story. And she says the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. And they make one story the only story. So, why do I start with that? Because she also goes on to say when you show people as one thing over and over, and that's what they become in your mind and often in the mind of the person about whom you are seeing this narrative. And so she says we run the risk of a very critical and cultural misunderstanding when we forget that everyone's lives and identities are comprised of overlapping stories, overlapping stories. So one of the reasons I dislike origin conversations is because they tend to be filled with, and necessarily so, overgeneralizations, oversimplification, and often overestimation, right? And so, because none of us were there, we're reliant upon a variety of stories that overlap, and that oftentimes also contradict. All right, so let me go back here. Okay. So my remarks today really take off from an exhibition that I was commissioned to create for the National Institute of Health and the National Library of Medicine, where they wanted to look at Martha Washington and foodways of the Chesapeake. And so part of this, to address this overgeneralization, I limit my remarks primarily to the Chesapeake because, like Liz, who's from New Orleans, I'm from, or Louisiana, I'm from the Eastern Seaboard, Virginia, Maryland, and so forth. So when we came together as an exhibition team, I ended up coming up with this notion that meals tell stories. And so as we were sitting around talking about what the exhibition would look like, um, I reminded people that one of the things that's important, as Liz has pointed out as well, is that when we talk about food, there are a whole interrelated set of systems: food conceptualization, the way that we procure or get food, the way it's distributed, the way it's preserved, the way it's consumed. All of this goes into the conversation about food. So we are not just going to just only focus on the food itself, but we have to talk about all of these elements. So the food stories that detail African Americans and Africans are very long and detailed, right? Um, by the time that Bacon's rebellion happens in and around 1676, which, if you know anything historically, it was a rebellion by both poor whites and enslaved Africans who by this time had come to this country. Um, it created a problem. And so this is what in part gave rise to the transatlantic slave trade. Economic factors, the fact that indentures no longer were in supply, racial factors, social unrest, and the belief that Africans were a more controllable workforce, right? The first Africans, not even the first, because many arrived in the 1500s, um, by way of as seamen, right? But the first 20 arrived in Virginia sometime around 1619, which is how you get the 1619 project and so forth. So when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, it's really important in here to look at these routes because they are very extensive. And you can see here the millions of enslaved people who did not come here as migrants, who came here as enslaved people. They they were stolen from their homelands. They were brought to South America. They were taken to North America, all the various places you see here. And then you see a number of the foodstuffs that were transported with them. So the skills held by Africans were not lost on slave traders, right? For this reason, slaves were taken from certain regions according to their knowledge of specific skills, their dispositions, and their benefits to New World markets. You can see it's mostly along the western coast of Africa. European slave traders like the British took Africans from different coastal regions, including the Bight of Benin, Senegambia, Sierra Leone, West Central Africa, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Biafra. They were taken to Brazil and the Caribbean to build the sugar industry, to the Carolinas for rice cultivation, and to the Chesapeake colonies for harvesting tobacco, amongst other crops. By the middle of the 17th century, trade in Africa had fully taken hold, linking Europe, Brazil, the Caribbean, and North America. And so I don't want to harbor on that, but I wanted to share that because the transatlantic slave trade is a central part of the ways in which foodstuffs arrived at various countries. And this was not um, just some folks getting on board a ship. As we know, they were captured, they were shackled, they were hoveled. Many died along the way. Now, where does food factor into this? Well, so Wanda Mustakim, who's a historian with broad specializations in slavery at sea, writes in her book, Slavery at Sea, about the ways in which, when preparing for overseas ventures in England, seamen loaded various foodstuffs, including beans, and in some case, stockfish, flour, bread, and beef, along with an assortment of liquors. Knowing the entanglement of dietary practices with health and preservation of future laborers, merchants occasionally, and this is all Mustakim, directed sailors' attention to these culinary matters, right? So a lot of these foods were also provision on West African slave ships, along with seafood, corn, and cassava to supplement feeding those who were enslaved. You also had things like palm oil, which is an ingredient often used in West Africa, pepper, lime juice, goat, dried fish, and so forth. And all of this she's getting from looking at seamen journals. There were also foods such as beef, pork, biscuit, flour, oatmeal, peas, butter, and cheese. They also carried salted meats, dried beans, rice, and yams because of their resistance to spoilage during lengthy voyages and to create larger meals accommodating larger groups. Of course, women were brought primarily according to many of these journals to dress the victuals, right? Now, as Liz mentioned, Native Americans, having already been here prior to the discovery by Columbus, contributed in part what is known as the Three Sisters, right? Corn, beans, and squash. Um, and also, they introduced techniques like smoking and drying meat, which, as we know today, influenced Southern barbecue. And so, cooking with maize and so forth um, was something that was introduced to European settlers, along with potatoes, pumpkins, various types of beans, peppers, and sassafras. And so these are, as Liz mentioned, new ways of cooking, right? Native American traditions included stews and soups, and they often feature foods like wild game, which may not have been and often wasn't, as Liz has pointed out, to the taste of those who are less familiar. And so it is from Native Americans to some extent that we get foods like grits, cornbread, succotash, and even many fried foods. Okay. in their book, The Shadow of Slavery and the Shadow of Slavery, these anthropologists, Judith Carney and Richard Rosenthal, noted that Africans grew the majority of the provisions that were used to keep themselves alive during the Middle Passage. Carney, who has conducted extensive field work on Africa and the African legacy in Brazil and Mexico, talks about the ways in which African ecology and development existed long before Africans came to this country, which is one of the reasons that they were captured and brought here. So Africans contributed such foods as the yellow or the white yam, because this really is the yam. It's a tuber. And if you cut it, that's what you'll see inside. Plantains, different types of peppers, as Liz mentioned, okra, black-eyed peas, pigeon peas, rice, watermelon, peanuts, sesame seeds, and like these malagueta peppers. Here's some pigeon peas here as well. And so here is an observation from Thomas Trotter, who was on the slave ship Brooks, and he says that the slaves first purchased growing exceedingly fat, and on that account urged to the matter the necessity of allowing them exercise. And he's talking here about the enslaved who were in the hovels below. He said their diet consisted of beans, rice, and Indian corn, alternately boiled, to which was added a sufficiency of guinea pepper and a small proportion of palm oil and Kalman salt. And again, most of this was prepared by the women who were brought aboard. Okay. So this panel that I'm showing you here was part of the exhibition I created for the National Library of Medicine. And here I talk about the notion of producing food and negotiating power, as we heard from Liz. All right. And specifically along the Potomac River. And for us, this should be of interest because we're here, for those of us who are here in this region. The Potomac River, as you know, surrounds Mount Vernon, Washington's home. And I write here that it was double-edged. It was a vehicle by which men, women, and children were sold into servitude, but it also offered a possible vehicle for freedom. And there's a third thing, it was the means by which foods were brought into the Chesapeake region. Here's another view of the Potomac River. So some of the foods that were eaten in the 1700s, as you see here, were given to enslaved persons included maybe salt pork, herring, cornmeal, beans, greens, some of which was, of course, grown in their garden. In fact, George Washington wrote in a letter to another English agriculturalist in 1792. He said that it was cheaper to feed blacks than white men because blacks can be given common food. This consists of, and I'm quoting from Washington, bread made of Indian corn, buttermilk, fish or pickled herrings, frequently, and meat now and then. In addition to these, ground is also allowed them for gardening and privilege given to raise dunghill fowls for their use. And he goes on to explain that on small farms, quote, who has not more than 2 or 3 Negroes, end quote, slave owners and slaves eat almost the same foods, whereas on larger plantations, it was different. So even for, like for the Europeans who had to adapt to Native American foodways, Africans too had to adapt to these new world food cultures. Lack of familiar surroundings, ingredients, and utensils with which to cook and eat also meant that African traditions had to merge with those that were native to the New World and colonial settlers occupying their lands. But if we're content to stop at believing enslaved people only ate scraps, then we miss the ingenuity and the survivalism, and will not consider the ways that Africans hunted, trapped, used fishing poles and slingshots and more. They ate terrapin, squirrel, snake, rat, and other critters. It is also important in crafting this narrative to debunk as many myths as possible. It's really important for me to do that. And here you'll see an installation from, again, Washington's Mount Vernon, and this is called the enslaved men's bunk. And you'll see the fish here. You'll see maybe a rabbit or a hare right there. There's some meal in a bowl there, and then there's something over here. So my point, and then there are tons of herbs here that are drying out as well. So the point is that we need to not assume that Black folks, Africans in particular, only survived off of what was given to them, but rather they were able to procure multiple sources because they were brought here for their agricultural knowledge and they were surrounded by agriculture, then therefore they made use of the land. Also, one of the foods that I have studied intensely is that of the guinea fowl or the chicken, right? And Black folks' connections to that. Captain Thomas Young wrote of a journey to Jamestown, Virginia in 1634, where he noticed that Africa or America was endowed with very great plenty of birds, fowls, and other foods. And here's what he wrote. Insomuch so that ordinary planters' houses of the better sort, we found tables furnished with pork, kids, chickens, turkeys, young geese, caponets, and other fowls as the seas of the year afforded. As Young rightfully observed, goose, duck, and chicken often appeared on the tables of the better sort. In 1709, William Byrd kept a detailed journal where he secretly recorded the minutiae of his daily life. While many dined, and he wrote that while many dined on hashed or fricasseed cold remains of turkey and geese, or boiled and roasted fowl, Byrd himself would break his fast only with boiled milk. So not only in that in that particular entry do we see the mention of a variety of foodstuffs here in the Chesapeake, but we also know that they were hashed, they were fricasseed, they were boiled, and they were roasted. Okay. So in short, the experiences of enslavement fractured the culinary experiences of African diasporic people, all of whom hail from different ethnic communities in their native countries. In the wake of slavery, new enclaves and new ethnic identities were created, and with it, new struggles and new ways of surviving. And of course, we get much of this information through the process of oral transmission. Recipes were changed as local ingredients were substituted and infused. Culinary historians like Jessica Harris, Robert Hall, more recently Michael Twitty, note spices and herbs were used often to disguise spoiled meats and to enhance flavors. More vegetables were added to the diet, as well as cooking techniques like grilling and roasting using cabbage instead of banana leaves. And different grasses and herbs were used as much for medicinal purposes as they were for enhancing stem variety, right? As I said here, some Africans were allowed to have gardens, and so those provisions could supplement their diets, but also enabled them to participate in internal and external plantation trade activities, meaning they could sell their foods not only to those who enslaved them, but others, sometimes on the plantation, sometimes off the plantation or the farm, and thus in some few cases accumulate enough money to buy one's freedom. Here we see in another installation offered by Nicole Moore, who's a public historian and a blogger, on consultant and interpreter of slave life. We see some greens and some okra, onions, tomatoes, etc., which would have been part of the diets of some Africans. All right, so let me end by talking just a little bit about the cook's day, because in addition to the foods that were brought, the ways in which Tony Tipton Martin and Maria Franklin and others talk about how food was stretched and augmented, made tasty and sustaining, while also fulfilling ritual and tradition, there's also the issue of work and labor, right? In the exhibition where I talk about fire and freedom, I do so because we oftentimes romanticize the hearth. But for African and African American women, the hearth was not a place of romanticism. It was a place of danger. It was a place of overheating, being scorched, being killed in some instances if you did not prepare foods correctly, right? And all of this becomes a part of the food story. One of the things that I often used to say when I attended, and I'm a founder of the Southern Foodways Alliance, but I used to say we cannot romanticize the ways in which food not only is commensurable in the sense that it enables us to engage and enjoy, but food can also be the product or the result or the catalyst for violence. Black women who didn't know how to cook, young girls could be punished, could be severely punished and have limbs um, maimed and other kinds uh, of violence is perpetrated upon them by the white women who were the plantation mistresses. And this is well documented. Um, so we have to look at the hearth as a place that was very much vexed, right? Because in addition to cooking, these women were also caring for children. They were sometimes doing knitting and things of that nature. All right. When we think about the ways that meals were produced, indigestion and other illnesses often arose. George Washington, for example, summoned slaves like the aged old doll to create remedies. Mint water, for example, was used to help relieve an upset stomach, and I'll come back to this in a moment. I wanted to just very quickly point out this bowl because the other thing that was often made was bread and biscuits and things of that nature. Lucy Lee, who was one of George Washington's enslaved cooks, would leave dough in a large bowl to rise for hours. She would thump the dough, sometimes using the side of a rolling pin for another hour until it was smooth. And then here you'll see the mixing bowl that she used that has been um, has been refurbished. Oh, sorry. The curators at Mount Vernon. Sorry, crazy dogs in the background. And then here's the recipe, for example, of mint water that oftentimes someone like Old Doll, even in her age, would have to wake up and prepare for Washington or whomever. And so I'm here closing now to say George or Martha Washington would often summon Old Doll, an aged slave, to make the mint water. The menthol helped to relieve a sore throat, an upset stomach, or indigestion. So slavery put in place social and culinary boundaries that could separate those who ate from those who worked. And this is important to remember so that we don't just um, focus only on the food. And I am closing. This portrait here called a 1796 portrait of the Washington family by Edward Savage suggests that those power dynamics often existed. You see the enslaved person here in the background. This one right here, Francis Edmunds' Devotion, shows you the dynamics that often occurred. We know that these meals were extensive um, and that people like Hercules, for example, who was considered a great chef in American history, was credited with making these foods. But here's the thing, and I'm just going to close out. Food times were also a time when many Africans used to escape, right? So at the center of all of our understanding of food conversations and the contributions to American um, cuisine, we cannot rule out the notion of freedom as well. By the time we get to 1866 with Melinda Russell's cookbook, which we often recognize, we are midway through the cemented culinary legacy of African Americans' recipes, innovation, and artistry. And along with that, notions of freedom, which continue to persist to this day. Here's a recipe for reversing the effects of poison, if you will. So, in all, this kind of culinary inventiveness is a central aspect of African culinary heritage. From the African imprint left on the foodways of the New World to the creative means of acquiring, procuring, and distributing foods, African American foodways has never been as simple as cooking and consuming portions. So we have to do away with that particular thing. Thank you.
Just to start out, I have my own question. I've been doing some reading about West African foodways, and millet is an important grain crop in West Africa. I wonder why that didn't transfer. Go ahead, Psyche.
Yeah, I'm not, that's a good question, Sheila. And I can't necessarily say for sure, other than it might have been one of the crops that did not translate well, in during the Middle Passage, right? Um, Also, you have similar kinds of foods like other kinds of grains. Um, and so I don't really know, but you're right, there's not much that is mentioned of millet. But I bet you if we were to look it up, we might find that it was just not one of those foods that um was readily um talked about. Now, according to one source, millet was transmitted to the Americas, just perhaps we don't hear about it as much, right? Um, so I think that would be one of those. I think Judith Carney's work might be useful for you there, because now that I think about it, I do recall some mention of millet. Look at Judith Carney's work. I think you'll find a better explanation. It might not have been as prominent. We hear a lot about cassava. We hear a lot about um, some of the other, the peppers and everything. It's also a lot about what people choose to write about, right? That doesn't mean that there weren't many more um, foods that were also transported. These are just the ones that tend to be regurgitated.
That's an ironic choice of words.
Intentional, no less.
Okay, well, Psyche, and Liz, if you don't mind, would you share your slides with us, and I can send them out to the registrants along with the
Yeah.
link to the recorded event? Because particularly Psyche, I know you've got a lot of references where people can explore these resources.
Sure.
And if I'm happy to share my very primitive paper PowerPoint, but there's one thing that I do want to talk about, which I always try to talk about that is the three thickeners of gumbo, one from each continent.
Hmm.
And now, of course, in the modern world, we think of them, let's just kind of use this one or that one, but they were very much used based on the season. So
Hmm. Hmm.
we have gumbo is a thick soup. I would call it a soup and not a stew because it's not as thick as a stew, but still it's kind of in between soup and stew. And it's always thickened. And so you have the Native American way, which would have been to use filé. Filé, for those of you who may not know, is the herb or the spice made from dried sassafras leaves. And the native people used to actually take as much as a cup of it and put it into boiling water, and it would thicken whatever it was that was being cooked. And it also adds its own flavor. But we, in the modern day, use filet to enhance the flavor and thicken gumbo. So that's the New World contribution to gumbo. The African contribution to gumbo is okra. And okra is a thickener. If you use it, that sort of mucilaginous aspect of it will thicken. But it was often used at the same time as you made a um, a seafood gumbo, because shrimp running and crabs running that happened at the same time as you were harvesting um, okra. And so because of that, it was the thickener for seafood gumbo. And then finally, you had the European contribution to thicken, but okra also adds a flavor. So these thickeners always add flavor. It's not like adding cornstarch or something that doesn't really give a flavor. The other thickener is roux. That was the European thickener that was toasted flour. And unlike making bechamel or something, where you really just want to cook the flour enough so that it doesn't taste raw, but you don't really color it, we toast that roux. We toast it until it's quite dark. It's oftentimes as dark as coffee. And that adds a flavor. And the more you toast it, the more you destroy the gluten so that it's not as thick as it might be if you just use the flour um, and didn't let it darken. And so that's the European contribution to gumbo. And here we have these three gumbos, and you would use one or another thickener based on, obviously this is before refrigeration. I mean, now you can get frozen gumbo, um, frozen okra anywhere and use it whenever you want. But let's go back before all that. And you would use the one that was at hand. If you were in the woods and you were making squirrel gumbo because you just shot some squirrel and you were out hunting or whatever, you would use filé because you could reach up into the trees and get filé just because it was there. And if it was the dead of winter and you were making something with a chicken or a sausage, you would probably use roux because that's what you had at hand. You had flour. And so I just love the idea that there are three different thickeners that are to make this product that is almost the one that people in New Orleans identify with as the representative of their cuisine. And it covers all three continents.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Psyche and Liz.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Yep, thank you.
Before we leave, I would like to update you about a couple upcoming live online events. Next Monday, August 11, we will hear from Michelle Evans, Senior Vice President of Global Lifestyle and Food and Beverage at Hilton International. She will be in conversation with our own Dom, Catherine Kerr. And the emphasis, I believe, will be on how mentoring helps women go from operations to management. Then on Tuesday, September 9th, we will address relationships between public relations and the media. This event will be moderated by LDEI board member and communications committee chair, Kate Howell, and will feature journalist Patricia Kobe and Proof PR founder and president Sarah Schiff. So don't miss that. You can sign up for to register for these events on the ldei.org website. And we will look forward to see you then. So for now, It's been wonderful to be with you today, and if you have any questions for me, you can reach out. So long for now, and see you next Monday. Bye bye.